All right, this screencast is going to dive somewhat deeply into a letter from a Birmingham jail, which was an essay written by Martin Luther King while he was in jail, as you might imagine, for acts of civil disobedience. And this was written at a time when the United States was beginning to change in terms of race relations in a very big way. Martin Luther King was an advocate for what he called not just civil disobedience, but what he called direct action. And so if you haven't had a chance to read this, it's really lengthy and you probably don't need to read all of it, but there are a few paragraphs that I want to focus on. Paragraph 7, in any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 steps: collection of the facts to determine whether injustices are alive, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. King says, we have gone through all these steps in Birmingham. There can be no gainsaying of the fact that racial injustice engulfs this community. Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. Its ugly record of police brutality is known to every section of this country. And it goes on from there. So, fact collection, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. Now, self-purification is something that you should probably understand. These actions that Martin Luther King referred to were purposeful. Now, in this essay, which is just a masterfully written piece explaining what they're trying to do, Martin Luther King advocates for this idea of direct action. And he does so almost seemingly reluctantly, because he talks about all these things that were promised during negotiations and how most of the promises were not kept, things like removing the signs. So here he talks about the signs remaining, even though they promised to remove these signs. And so he makes this passionate argument for direct action. And paragraph 10 is a really good one to look at. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You're exactly right in your call for negotiation. Indeed, this is the purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such a creative tension. Now, this is a very important idea. If you just let the status quo remain, if you just leave things as they are, nothing's going to change. And the reality was that people in the North, where there wasn't a lot of racial discrimination, didn't experience what this segregation stuff is all about. It's something that happened in the South, largely. But look at what he says in this paragraph. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has consistently refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks to dramatize the issue so that it can no longer be ignored. Just referred to the creation of tension as part of the work of the nonviolent resistor. This may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I've earnestly worked and preached against violent tension, but there is a type of constructive nonviolent tension that is necessary for growth. Now, and he goes on and on and on. Now, then he talks about the timing of it and basically says, well, why not now? And this is another famous line from this, which is worth looking at. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Sounds kind of familiar. Declaration of Independence, maybe? Whole purpose of that document was to justify violence for the goal of freedom. Don't forget that. It talks about how we're supposed to wait And just, again, he goes on to say this is just not feasible anymore. Now, I want to show you something, and this had a YouTube warning on it, but I want to show you what he was talking about. You may have seen this, maybe not, but I'm going to show you a clip from the lunch counter sit-ins and use it to talk about. So here it is. Now, that is really tough to watch, but what I want you to think about is the most important thing in that room was the camera. Because King was not foolish enough to think that word would spread about this, if, word of mouth. These acts of civil disobedience were before cameras to capture what was really happening in the South. And I think a lot of people were shocked and horrified by these types of images because it shows who the oppressors were and who the oppressed were. And there's probably a lot of other ones lots of other footage you can find, I'm sure, on YouTube of this stuff. But creative tension, what is it? These kids are just going in to be served at a restaurant. Of course, they were violating the whites-only lunch counter policy. They knew that it was going to provoke a response, but they had to be very, very careful that they were not the aggressors. And going back to King's self-purification, they trained for this. And I don't know if you've seen the documentaries on this or not, but you can find footage of these civil rights groups that practiced this stuff. They sat and they practiced what was going to happen. And it just so happens that the violence did occur, but it was not on the part of the protesters. It was on the part of the people who were violently opposed to desegregation. So here's paragraph 14, has some things to think about as well. One may ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer is found in the fact that there are two types of laws. There are just laws and there are unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. What is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether one law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with moral law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority, and it gives the segregated a false sense of inferiority. Now, as I said, this is just a brilliantly written essay, and it's quite lengthy. I think he himself kind of alludes to that as you go further into the essay, but what we've just went over is the gist of it. And very, very important document to understand this idea of civil disobedience. Okay.